Hello and welcome to Quadriga. Around the world, one person is forcibly displaced nearly every 2 seconds. That's the highest level of displacement on record. It amounts to over 70 million people trying to flee to safety, often risking their lives. In the Mediterranean, 600 migrants drowned in the first half of this year alone. After a 2-week standoff with Italian authorities, who were blocking access to ports, a German rescue ship last week forced its way into the port of Lampedusa, leading to the prompt arrest of the captain. Migrants seeking entry to the U.S. also face dangers, including cramped and unhygienic conditions in holding camps along the southern border with Mexico. Trapped refugees, rescue forbidden? That's our title this week on Quadriga, and here are our guests. Maria Alvarez from Costa Rica is a refugee activist and founder of the Migration Hub. She says, "We don't combat irregular migrants by letting them die while crossing borders. We do it by offering safe and regulated pathways and fair migratory policies both for the country and for those migrating." Sulin Sardoschau works at the Humboldt University, and she's an expert on migration issues. She says humanitarian rhetoric alone doesn't make humanitarian policy. U.S. and EU migration policies are more similar than we may think. And it's a pleasure to welcome Malte Lehming back to the program. He works for the daily newspaper Der Tagesspiegel, and he says we will only achieve a humane European refugee policy if EU citizens assent. Europe has had to tighten its borders in order to prevent right-wing populists from gaining the upper hand. So, Sulin, let me start out by asking you about the numbers that we're seeing. As I mentioned, this is, in fact, the biggest wave of refugees worldwide on record since the Second World War. Why is that? And must we expect this trend, in fact, to continue rising?
It's indeed the case that the refugee influx to Europe has been unprecedented since World War II. But the reasons are very diverse. We see people fleeing from war, but also people searching for opportunities in Europe. So there's, on the one hand, the intensification of war and conflict in the Middle East and hardships in South America that lead to large movements of people. But there's also economic developments in Africa that lead to an increase in the number of migrants arriving from there and also crossing the Mediterranean through Libya.
Maria, those who advocate tighter borders often see refugees as people who are making an economic choice, basically looking for a better life. Those who advocate doing more to open borders to receive them typically see refugees as victims, for example, of conflict, of environmental disaster, and so on. We've just heard it's a lot more complicated than that. What does that mean for policy?
Well, actually, you just said it correctly, right? I mean, we have to make a distinction between who's a refugee and who's an asylum seeker and who's actually looking for economical opportunities, right? So we have to distinguish that in the first place. And yes, of course, especially when we talk about what's happening in the Mediterranean and people fleeing out, especially from Libya these days. I mean, I guess was Chester, right? That a strike happened and killed 40 people in a migrant camp in Libya. So of course it's unjust, right? So what it means for policy means that many countries have signed up and has committed to this global compact recently, which is basically to safeguard and try to prevent these people from dying from the sea and actually creating more safe pathways for migrants to come. Obviously, countries like Italy, Austria, Australia, and United States were the ones who signed up. Is the global compact, for example, a solution? Of course not, but it's a commitment from these companies to strengthen and actually basically to take care of the pathways of migrants when they're migrating.
Malte, as you pointed out with your opening statement, anti-migrant sentiment, essentially xenophobia often, has become a driving force for right-wing populism in Europe. But if you look at the statistics, rich Europe has taken in only 16% of the total number of people who are fleeing. It's actually poor African and Middle Eastern countries that have taken in the vast bulk of migrants worldwide. Is that fair?
It might not be fair, and I mean, you're completely correct. I mean, the Syrian migrants from Syria, they basically are in Turkey, in Jordan, and in Lebanon. I think 6 million of us, 7 million of them are in these three countries combined. So if you compare it to these three countries, Europe, as a bloc, has not taken in a lot. But, and there is a but to it, the but is you have to reconcile the humanitarian imperative to help those people with the acceptance of the local people. And it seems to be lacking a huge part of acceptance, as you mentioned in your question, in the first part of your question. And you witness, as a consequence of this, the rise of a lot of basically right-wing populism in Europe that is the consequence of an open border policy. So it's not a question of fairness, it's a question of how many could be reconciled with the societies and nation states in Europe.
Sulin, as you implied in your opening statement, there is a lot of humanitarian rhetoric in Europe, but you were essentially saying that the practice is something else. The fact is, there is a strong body of migration law in place. We have rules and systems and processes for how to deal with the flow of migrants. But obviously that system is broken, or we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Yeah, so the body of law does not reflect the political reality. And this is something that I want to come back to, which is making this connection between the influx of refugees and right-wing populism is not that clear, right? The countries that are most opposed to it in Europe, namely Poland and Hungary, those are the countries that had the least influx of refugees in Europe, right? So they base their anti-refugee rhetoric on sort of a threat perception around refugees, right? And this is the thing that we have to tackle. I don't think people are opposed to the humanitarian idea of taking in refugees. I think what they are afraid of is the unregulated, uncontrolled way that refugees are entering. So by saying that we should not save people from the Mediterranean because that will fuel right-wing support, I don't think is the real narrative. The narrative is to bring people over to Europe safely and have them vetted, have them background checked, and be humanitarian also in the size of migrants that we want to bring in. Not just saying, we just shut it off in order to, you know, drain the right-wing rhetoric. That's not what we should do. I think this is also not the solution to this rhetoric because it is based on a threat perception rather than on reality, in my opinion.
I want to come back to you, Malte. I know you wanted to respond to that, but let's just take a brief look at the situation in the Mediterranean, and particularly a look at just how dysfunctional the practice there has become. It was illustrated in the past few weeks when we saw a crisis that essentially pitted the captain of a German refugee ship against Italy's populist leader.
Italy's Interior Minister Matteo Salvini, nicknamed Capitano. He owes this not to his love of the sea, but to his strict policy on refugees. She, on the other hand, is a real captain, German refugee aid worker Carola Rackete. Many consider her a hero. 2 weeks ago, she took 53 refugees aboard the Sea-Watch 3 and brought them to Italy. Despite Salvini's entry ban, she finally decided on the Saturday night to enter the port on the small Italian island of Lampedusa.
We declared a state of necessity because the psychological situation and the humanitarian condition has been worsening so much that I cannot guarantee the safety of the rescued people.
The captain was under arrest for several days for entering the port illegally, and because Sea-Watch 3 collided with a border patrol boat. Salvini thinks she should spend years behind bars. He says it was a criminal, warlike act. Is Carola Rackete a hero or a criminal?
So, Malte, who's right? The captain, Ms. Rackete, or Salvini?
No, the captain is right. I mean, you have to save lives. Point. There is no discussion about it, and there's no but to it. There's nothing else. That's a humanitarian imperative. You cannot let people die who are in need. So there's nothing to add for it. Having said that, there is a dilemma we are facing. The dilemma is you don't want to encourage people to go on an adventurous trip that might kill you. So by saving lives, you're sending messages too to people who are coming. So this is a dilemma. You cannot escape just easily in saying, I want to blend out the consequences of it. You have to save lives. That there is no but to it, but there is something that you're encouraging people to go on this.
I want to take that point to the other guests in just a moment, but let me just ask you one other thing that goes back to your opening statement and the idea that we may have to tighten borders in order to prevent right-wing populists from gaining the upper hand. In fact, don't actions like Salvini's tightening the borders of Italy in many ways feed the kind of xenophobia that Sulin just described rather than actually reducing it?
It's hard to say what is first and what is second, and what is the consequence of what. I mean, Italy seems to be an example that, I mean, the Lega Nord, where she's the party chief of, the Lega Nord is up in the polls. I think it's now a support rate of 35% of Italians. This is terrifying. Even Salvini is making all these speeches. Maybe he's fueling it, but maybe he's just reflecting a sentiment that is in Italy. And Italy, as you mentioned in the first place, was one of the countries that most refugees came in from the Mediterranean. And they had a huge influx of immigrants. So this is a very, very complicated connection between what causes what. There is clearly xenophobic sentiments in right-wing populism that has to be fight. You have to fight these xenophobic, anti-foreigner sentiments. On the other hand, you have to reflect that there is no consensus in the societies in Europe about how many migrants could come into one country.
So let me come back now to this question of incentives and disincentives, because that, in fact, was in your opening statement, Anna Maria, that you said we won't combat illegal migration by letting people die at the borders. Is that, in fact, what you think Salvini is doing, trying to disincentivize people to come? Mm-hmm. And clearly you don't think it works in that case?
Irregular migration, of course, to my extent, I don't think anybody's illegal, but absolutely. I mean, what we should not fall into agendas, and they have a particular agenda, and they have been using, I mean, call it United States, call it in Italy as well, in countries where they don't have that many refugees or migrants coming. It's an agenda, and we need to find a way how can we deal with the civil society and tell them not to fall into this agenda, which is minimizing the fact that migrants exist. And basically what we should be working on and what we should be doing is to kind of bring back the dignity to migrants, which we've been using in the past 3 years for political agendas. So of course he's not right? So the problem here is that the more we fall under the discussion whether Sea-Watch did the right thing or not, of course it is. There's no point out of this, right? I mean, but the process that is going to continue out of here, I don't think that he is going to stop there, because, I mean, they're going to continue coming. And who's going to be out there? Who's going to risk their personal liability and their organizations to go and continue rescuing? For example, there is this boat, a German boat called Juventa, who was just released, actually, I think this week, after 2 years of being kept by the Italian government. So they couldn't go out to operate in the Mediterranean Sea for 2 years. And if we would be supporting somebody, it should be these organizations who are actually doing the most decent act of humanity.
Let me just pronounce one thing. I mean, if you look, it's not just Italy. From Finland to Greece, from the Netherlands to Denmark to France, in all these countries, there had been a backlash after 2015. Backlash from governments saying, and they took over the rhetoric of the right-wing populism. We need to secure our borders. We need stricter policies, and so on, because the pressure from all the societies were just growing on these governments.
Sulin, do you have any sympathy for Italy's position? Hasn't the EU in many ways let Italy bear the brunt of the refugee crisis, at least in the Mediterranean?
Yeah, I mean, there's two important points that I think are worth making in this debate. First is I don't think this is a crisis of refugee numbers. This is a crisis of refugee accommodation and refugee policy. This is why we experienced the backlash after 2015, because the EU hasn't been able to practice real solidarity and provide an infrastructure that helps countries stem the influx of migrants. I don't think it's the migrants themselves. We'd have to take a hard look not at securing our borders and making sure fewer migrants come. We have to take a hard look at European solidarity and how we will manage refugee influxes in the future, because this is not a story that is over now. This is going to be something that we will deal with in the future as well. And if we just close our eyes and say, okay, if we keep the refugees outside of European borders, then our problem is solved. This is not the case. And the second point I want to make is this idea of this symbolic discussion about saving refugees from the Mediterranean, and this is why we're incentivizing them. This is closing our eyes towards the real issues that drive migration, the real push factors. It's not the push factor or the pull factor if we save people in the Mediterranean. The real push factors are economic, are security, are climate change, our technological progress. And if we keep having those placeholder debates about a few boats saving lives, which is a humanitarian imperative, which you've said, we stop talking about the real issues. And this is what we have to fight. We have to push these placeholder debates away and start talking about the real push and pull factors. And this is not what we do with this Sea-Watch debate.
So essentially, Sulin is saying this is very much about the fact that once refugees do arrive in Europe or in the United States, we are not doing enough, as you said, to accommodate them, to integrate them, to process their asylum applications, and so on. Interestingly enough, Malte, that actually was a point that was made by Salvini in relation to the Sofia mission. Sofia is a naval mission of the EU, I think in operation since 2015. The idea was to try to stop human smuggling in the Mediterranean, particularly coming out of Libya, but elsewhere as well. Salvini has complained that the mission has turned into essentially a refugee rescue mission in which the refugees are then simply deposited on Italian territory rather than being distributed across the EU in accordance with existing EU law. Doesn't he have a point?
I think Sofia rescued 44,000 people in the Mediterranean. And as I said, the humanitarian imperative is always so strong. You say you have to rescue these people. On the other hand, I already described what I would call the dilemma. The more you rescue, the more people feel they will be rescued.
So you think it incentivizes illegal migration?
And there is, I mean, they are all they're connecting themselves. They all have their mobiles and talking about how to come to Europe because that's what they want. And I don't blame them that they want to come, but it's just how the system works. I mean, I would love to have a common European refugee policy. I would love to have it. Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, tried to have it for 4 years. Every week, every month, every day, she was saying, we need that, we need a fair quota system, and so on and so on. And she couldn't get it because Europe is not united in refugee policy. So this is, yes, you're right, we need one, but we don't have one.
The discussion about incentives and disincentives has played a very big role in the U.S. debate as well. So let's now turn to the situation on the southern border of the United States and take a look at the problems there. Refugees are drowning there as well as here, as a recent photo showed to very powerful effect.
This image has circulated around the world. Oscar Ramirez and his nearly 2-year-old daughter, Angie Valeria, were trying to flee when they drowned in the border river Rio Grande. They came from El Salvador heading for the United States, but like so many others, they didn't make it. At home in El Salvador, Oscar's mother, Rosa Ramirez, clings to belongings and photos of her son and granddaughter.
El último mensaje que me mandó el sábado.
The last thing he said to me on Saturday
Me puso de que
was, "Mama,
mamá,
I love you.
te amo, me puso.
Don't worry, we're fine."
Cuídense.
That was his
Nosotros aquí
last
estamos
message.
bien. Yo cuando leí ese mensaje
But even if the father and daughter had crossed the river, things wouldn't have been easy for them in America under Donald Trump. Border police and right-wing militia are hunting down immigrants from Latin America like never before. Tens of thousands of them are being held in US prisons and camps, men, women and children. Hardly anyone is allowed to stay.
You wouldn't believe how bad these people are. These aren't people. These are animals. And we're taking them out of the country at a level and at a rate that's never happened before.
Is the American dream no longer for everyone?
Anna Maria, Donald Trump has long been talking about a crisis at the southern border, and in fact, the recent numbers appear to be bearing him out. Why are we seeing what is truly an enormous tide of people coming across that border? And what is prompting acts of such desperation as Oscar Ramirez trying to swim with his toddler daughter?
Nobody would put their son or their daughter in the water if the land would be more dangerous. You know, so let's not forget that. Central America, especially the Northern Triangle, has a history with the United States over decades, even the last century. But recently, we cannot forget that by the end of last year, we saw this caravan, people coming together from the Northern Triangle, because the journey, the road was very dangerous for many of them who were fleeing out. Ever since 2012, we saw a real peak, an increase of migrants, particularly unaccompanied minors. So this is the time that the caravan, they organize themselves together because the road is very dangerous, especially crossing Mexico. They're having a lot of deals, and right now Donald Trump is trying to basically push Mexico to deal with the whole situation. In fact, yesterday, a federal court ruled that it is unconstitutional for Donald Trump to keep these people in detention centers without a hearing. So now we can say that what Donald Trump is doing is unconstitutional.
Just tell us very briefly what the conditions are like in those detention centers. There was a big headline recently about the fact that young children were being held without access to soap and toothpaste. Conditions have been called inhumane. What is the problem there? Why are border authorities unable to provide humane care?
Yeah. I mean, let's not forget that these people are fleeing out from violence, drug cartels, and poverty. And when they arrived to the border, especially many of them since last year in November with the caravan, their children were separated from their parents. So they're still there together. There is a number at around 2,300 children, who many of them are alone. And that already, besides, is unconstitutional before their asylum seeker process is going. But it's completely deplorable to have that many people concentrating in spaces which is not even for them. On top of that, they're alone and nobody's taking care of them. So that already, by itself, it's already wrong.
Sulin, is it a funding issue, or is it perhaps again an issue of attempting to deter migration by showing people that conditions are abysmal? Donald Trump has said something of that nature. Would you ascribe that motivation to the entire U.S. government?
I think there's a combination of, again, a management crisis and an inability to prepare for things that they themselves have been warning about for months. But we see parallels with European policy as well, right? So we see Donald Trump threatening Mexico with tariffs. What Germany is doing, or what the EU is doing, is traveling around Africa and offering development assistance to curb migration, right? We extend the number of safe third countries in Europe, and Trump wants to make a deal with Mexico as a treaty, an immigration security treaty, to treat Mexico as the country, sort of a Dublin system where they have to claim asylum in Mexico themselves. So there's a lot of parallels, not only in the imagery that you showed before, but also in the policy level.
But surely it is not false to give development assistance to try to help people in the countries where they live.
So the question is, why do we give development assistance, right? Do we give it to actually foster economic growth in those countries, or is it sort of a financial incentive to decrease migration?
No, but it is a funding issue, because there is obviously in these centers there needs to be a better conditions. But what we have to do is to basically call the Congress to monitor what is happening with that money, because that money is not arriving for the people who are in the detention centers.
Malte Lehming, one sentence, let me take us back to our title, Trapped Refugees, Rescue Forbidden. Do you think we will see this system change anytime soon?
No. It's a very, very short answer, but I can't see it. I can't see a consensus in the European Union. I can't see a consensus in the United States, even though the Democratic Party is not an open border party as well, because they even supported for billions of money to secure the borders there. So
I'm going to have to cut you off right there. Thank you all for being with us. Thanks to all of you out there for tuning in. See you soon.